Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Kelly Toups, and I'm the Director of Nutrition at Oldways. And Oldways is the organization that founded and runs the Oldways Whole Grains Council. So at the Whole Grains Council, our mission is to help consumers understand the benefits of whole grain foods, to help manufacturers produce more and better whole grain products, and then also to be a resource for journalists who are writing about whole grains. So we had kind of the agricultural perspective here, and our focus is more on the consumer and manufacturer side. So it was really great to learn more about that aspect of it. You may also be familiar with the whole grain stamp. It's a packaging symbol that we have that's on more than 12,000 products. And basically the number in the stamp, the gram amount, tells the customer how many grams of whole grains are in a serving of the product. That way they can compare between products and find ones that have more and more whole grains. So there's a number of different reasons why we might want to switch to make more of our grains whole. But today my remarks are mostly going to focus on nutrition. And when we talk about whole grains, just as a reminder, we're talking about grains that have all of their bran, germ, and endosperm. Now, when grains are refined, typically the bran and germ are removed, leaving only the endosperm. And so nutritionally, we're going to see differences in some of the micronutrients, as well as things like fiber and protein. So I think this chart kind of illustrates some of the differences that you might see in whole wheat versus refined wheat. The green bar being the nutrients that are in whole wheat, the red bars being what's left when the wheat is refined, and then the yellow bars being what's added back in when grains are enriched. So there are some enriched wheat products available on the market, but they're not necessarily nutritionally equivalent to whole grains. Only a handful of the vitamins are getting added back, and not necessarily in the same proportion as they were before. We see a similar pattern when brown rice is milled into white rice. And then we also see a similar pattern when cornmeal is refined as well. So as many of the speakers mentioned today, we have a disconnect. Looking in the dietary guidelines for Americans, although they are gradually eating more and more whole grains, they're still falling short. And Dr. McDonald spoke to some of the challenges as far as shifting land use, but with grains it's interesting because the raw product is available. There's a lot of farmers that are growing grains, and really the disconnect seems to be at other points in the food system. So, for example, while we've seen increases in interest in whole grain products like whole wheat bread, whole grain cereals, things like that, only 5% of the wheat flour that's milled in the U.S. is whole wheat flour right now. So as far as using the food chain to increase whole grain consumption, as I mentioned, there are farmers growing grains. So there is some raw material that's available, and I don't think it would be as drastic of a shift for us to move our food system to have more whole grains than it would be perhaps to go from growing grains to growing more broccoli, as you mentioned earlier. But that being said, one size doesn't fit all. So refined all-purpose flour is somewhat more predictable to work with. But when you're working with some of these whole wheat flours that have their bran and germ, the properties aren't necessarily the same. And I think Klaus illustrated that beautifully with some of the examples of the flavor differences in the different wheat varieties. But the challenges extend beyond just flavor, also into performance. So, for example, Dr. Jones at Washington State University, who you mentioned, has started to do some research in this area, and what he's found that is if a particular wheat variety, he's worked with some that didn't make very good bread, but ended up making beautiful pasta. So I think when manufacturers started to first go down this journey, it may have been discouraging for some producers if, the particular variety they used for their product didn't meet the specifications that they were looking for. And I think, as far as what we can do to move our food system towards having more whole grains, we're going to need a lot more research in this area. This is kind of just the beginning as far as what varieties of wheat are best selected for different things, whether you're looking at micronutrient attributes, as you mentioned with some of the vitamin A, or if we're looking for performance characteristics and how something, would perform in a pancake versus a loaf of bread versus some other kind of product. There's, I think, a lot more research to be done here. Another thing to think about as far as shifting the food patterns in the U.S. is that these changes don't happen overnight, and that can be really frustrating for some of us in the public health world. But it's just not realistic to take someone who is a habitual fast food, ultra-processed food consumer one day and then overnight move them to be like an organic CSA subscriber who brews their own kombucha. You just don't see that happen overnight. So we need to have these middle steps so that we can move people along the system and, continue bringing the bottom up, developing more and more products that have higher levels of whole grains so that consumers can, learn about these products, get exposed to them, and then gradually shift their habits. And we are seeing this to a certain extent. I think breakfast cereal is a good example. A lot of the major brands of breakfast cereal have whole grain as a first ingredient. We see it with bread too. Whole grain breads are becoming more and more common. And then from the policy level, we've also seen this as far as school lunchrooms being required to serve whole grains to their students, so these children, getting exposed to that in the classroom as well. I think each of these areas are necessary and are all really important to help us slowly move the needle forward. Another thing that we're seeing is ancient grains, or as you were saying, kind of designer grains, I think is the term that you used. We get so many questions about ancient grains at the Whole Grains Council. People call us, everyone wants to know what the next quinoa is. But I think just this increased food literacy in general and people being more curious about where their food's coming from has certainly helped people be more open-minded to trying some more whole grain foods. When we tell our patients that they need to eat more vegetables, they understand that that doesn't mean just eat spinach and that's the only vegetable they eat. I think people intuitively understand that there's a lot of different vegetables out there and that it's a good idea to get some spinach, but also some carrots, some tomatoes, and, a variety of things. But for whatever reason, I think people have forgotten about the variety that's available within the grain foods category. A lot of people, are familiar with whole wheat, brown rice, corn, but sometimes forget about some of the other varieties of grains that are out there. And these other greens don't just have nutritional attributes that are beneficial, but also have really interesting culinary applications as well as sustainability applications. And then lastly, I think we need to invest in mechanical innovations. If a manufacturer is trying to reformulate a product to include more whole grains, it's just not always as simple as substituting one for one. So not only, might they want to look at what type of whole grain might work best for the type of product that they want to make, but the machinery they have might not be optimized to deal with the extra bran and germ. So just, talking to people in the field, doing research on, what kind of mechanical innovations might be needed, I think is also helpful, especially given, the statistic about how much of the flour is produced that's refined flour. Having, more information and research available would certainly be helpful if we want to invest in making this change. So we do get a lot of questions about ancient grains, but I also wanted to share this with you. And I apologize if the font is a little small to read, but last summer, about a year ago, we took 1,500 people, census representative survey, and we asked them about, how often they eat whole grains, what types of whole grains they eat, all kinds of questions just to get a sense of their attitudes and behaviors. And so for one question, we had a big list of grains and asked them to select which they've heard of, and then of the ones they've heard of, which have they actually tried? And then of the ones they've actually tried, which ones are their favorites? And so, I think being immersed in this world, I hear a lot about quinoa and amaranth and spelt and things like that. But it's really kind of the standbys that people are citing as their favorites. And I think a lot of that is exposure. In a lot of communities across the U.S., people might not have been exposed to some of these lesser known grains, and they also might not, be available in every grocery store. So I think that's part of it. But I think it also goes to show that, including more whole grains in the diet doesn't necessarily have to be expensive. Brown rice, whole grain cereal, there's a lot of more affordable options out there as well for consumers where price is something they need to look at. And then lastly, I just wanted to share where you can learn more. So our website, wholegrainscouncil.org, has a lot of resources, mainly for consumers, but we do have a whole grain health studies database where we have a lot of research on whole grains that you can kind of sort by the outcome. And then we also have, infographics and recipes and things like that. So we do a lot of education and outreach to consumers in addition to our work with manufacturers. So yeah, I think that's it.